As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So a senior U.S. official said that the death toll caused by Israel's assault on Gaza is likely far higher than the over 10,000 number that's being reported by Gaza's health ministry. So these comments were made by Barbara Leaf. She is an assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern Affairs. And what she said breaks from President Biden's claim that the numbers from Gaza's health ministry can't be trusted. She said, quote, "In this period of conflict and conditions of war, it is very difficult for any of us to assess what the rate of casualties are. We think they're very high, frankly, and it could be that they are even higher than are being cited. We'll know after the guns fall silent. We take in sourcing from a variety of folks who are on the ground. I can't stipulate to one figure or another. It's very possible they're even higher than is being reported," end quote. So the latest numbers from Gaza's health ministry on Thursday put the death toll at 10,569 Palestinians. So this article is from AP, and it's just about the situation for the people on the ground in Gaza, and I just want to read some of it. So fistfights break out in breadlines. Residents wait hours for a gallon of brackish water that makes them sick. Scabies, diarrhea, and respiratory infections rip through the overcrowded shelters, and some families have to choose who eats. So they quote Susan Wahadi. She's an aid worker and a mother of 5 at a UN shelter. And she said, quote, "My kids are crying because they are hungry and tired and can't use the bathroom. I have nothing for them," end quote. So Palestinians who managed to flee Israel's ground invasion in northern Gaza now encounter scarcity of food and medicine in the south, and there is no end in sight to the war that was sparked by the Hamas attack on October 7th. Over 500,000 displaced people have crammed into hospitals and UN schools turned shelters in the south. The schools, overcrowded, strewn with trash, swarmed by flies, have become a breeding ground for infectious disease. Since the start of the war, several hundred aid trucks have entered Gaza through the southern Rafah crossing, but aid organizations say that's a drop in the ocean of need. For most people, each day has become a drudging cycle of searching for bread and water and waiting in lines. And this article just goes on to say how it is straining Gaza's close-knit society. People are getting mad at each other, and this is what happens when populations don't have enough food to eat. People turn on each other, and very ugly things can happen. And talking about the disease and stuff, I mean, if this war continues, and it looks like it's going to continue, I think we're going to start seeing a lot of Palestinians die of disease and hunger, and it's just going to be, it's just an untenable situation for these people, just crammed into these shelters with nowhere to go. So a bipartisan group of 16 members of Congress has called on President Biden to drop the case against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, warning of the grave threat to press freedom if he is convicted. So the lawmakers made this call in a letter sent to President Biden on Wednesday. The effort was led by Representatives Thomas Massie, Republican from Kentucky, and James McGovern, Democrat from Massachusetts. They began circulating this letter to get their colleagues to sign last month. If you remember, I did cover that when there was news that they were circulating the letter. So now they have sent it. I wish they could have gotten more signatures than 16, but it's something. So one excerpt from the letter, it reads, quote, "It is the duty of journalists to seek out sources, including documentary evidence, in order to report to the public on the activities of government. The United States must not pursue an unnecessary prosecution that risks criminalizing common journalistic practices and thus chilling the work of the free press. We urge you to ensure that this case be brought to a close in as timely a manner as possible," end quote. And this letter comes as the Biden administration has been under pressure from the Australian government to free Assange, who is an Australian citizen. In September, a delegation of Australian members of parliament from across the political spectrum visited Washington and met with U.S. officials to lobby for Assange. Australia's prime minister was also just in Washington, and he brought up Assange with Biden at the White House. Australia's got a lot of leverage they could use, which they're not really using. They could be doing more to put the screws on Biden because they're signed this AUKUS military pact. The U.S. is building up its military footprint in Australia. Doesn't seem like they're trying to leverage anything, though. So Slovakia's new government under Prime Minister Robert Fico has rejected a plan to provide Ukraine with a military aid package that was approved by the previous government. So Fico, whose Smer SD party won elections in October, he campaigned to end military aid to Ukraine, and he's followed through on the promise. His government squashed this weapons package for Ukraine at a cabinet meeting on Wednesday. The military aid package included air defense rockets, 125 millimeter cannon ammunition, and 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition. So Slovakia, is a small NATO country, but they have been providing Ukraine with some significant military aid. They gave Ukraine their MiG-29 fighter jets. Those are Soviet-made jets, making them only the second country after Poland, the second NATO country to give fighter jets to Ukraine. Only Poland and Slovakia have done it yet. You have the other European countries that have promised to send the F-16s, but the training's still in progress. So that's pretty significant aid that they gave. So this is, another sign that Ukraine is going to have trouble maintaining support in the West. Another thing that the new government is against is more sanctions on Russia. Hungary, up to this point, has been the only EU country that kind of tries to, blocks the sanctions on Russia, tries to get them watered down. And they can cause a lot of trouble, just one country opposing them. So now that there's two, that could be a lot harder for the EU to increase the sanctions.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
As I keep saying, when all else fails, they take you to war. It went from the COVID war to the Ukraine war and now the Israel war. So now they hit the markets. Let's see. The S&P 500 slipped 0.8%, snapped its longest winning streak since 2021.
Absolute bullshit.
It ain't a fucking winning streak. It's a rigged fucking game. The whole thing is going down big. Wouldn't you love to be living in the Middle East right now, particularly Israel? Your economy is going to do great. Countries at war. People is, oh yeah. China, again, all the data's in your magazine. The Trends Journal will give you more right now. So why did the markets go down? Quote, the Federal Market Committee, a bunch of fucking scumbags, is committed to achieving a stance. Hey, listen to this fucking crap. Who the fuck are you talking to? The fucking banksters, that a cocksucking prick, probably a real cocksucker because he wasn't a man, Woodrow Wilson, that gave us World War I, the IRS, federal income tax, and made up the fucking Federal Reserve. Anyway, I got to calm down. The Federal Open Market Committee is committed to achieving a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring down inflation to 2% over time. We are not confident that we have achieved such a stance. His remarks to the International Monetary Fund. You mean International Mafia Federation? Oh, this is the Powell. This is the Grand Powell who said there was no inflation. It was only temporary, only transitory. Now swallow more of my shit. It's shit day. It's fucking shit day every day. Shit coming out of the politicians' mouths. The bullshit repeated by the little fucking prostitute ballers. And I can't say the other word. Bitches and bastards. All they're selling is
bullshit.
That's all they sell.
Bullshit.
So the market, I'm telling you, man, this thing's going to go down. With the war going on in the Middle East, this is big. It ain't going to stop. Again, nobody has a fucking clue the 39 weeks of protests going on. I ask everybody. They don't know dick about shit about the protests going on in Israel before this happened. They don't know anything about what that, quote, extreme right-wing government, there it all is in your Trends Journal since the beginning of the year, has been doing to the Palestinians. This thing is going to expand. So, and Syria and Iran, what Israel's doing, it can bomb anybody that they want. Again, this is the Crusades 2000 that we have warned about. Yep. Moving on. China deal-making slump sends bankers' fees to lowest in decades. No shit. Writing about it in your Trends Journal week after week after week after week. Now it's in the Wall Street Journal. Chinese markets become investment problem. The second largest economy in the world, going down the crap. But thanks to the COVID war, the zero COVID policy of 3 years of lockdown that fucked the country up. Central banks insist rates will remain higher. Okay. Everybody's saying the rates are going to go higher, and they may. We say they're going to go down in November. Goldman Sachs came out today. They said they're going to go higher. We say they're going to, not November, in next year, for the run-up of the November elections. So we say they're going to go down in 2024. That's our bet. Israel businesses buckle under wars as war inflicts heavy toll. This is Financial Times. Yep. The businesses are fucked. Yep. It's right there. Bloomberg. U.S. debt held by younger than 50-year-old rose to a record in the third quarter. The Dow Jones is doing great. They just had their best time since 2021 as everybody's going fucking broke. Not everybody, the majority. The most indebted households are those between the ages of 40 and 50. You're right at the height of your life. Yep. Auto loan balances rose by 13 billion last quarter to a record 1.6 trillion to buy a piece of fucking shitty car with all this stupid electronic fucking high-tech crap brought to you by the fucking geeks. The trunk opens by itself. Beep, 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 beep. I got a bunch of stupid shit. It keeps going on. Serious delinquencies for auto loans or loans 90 days longer past due are the highest since the Great Recession. For borrowers in their 20s and 30s. The markets are going to go down. The whole fucking thing's going down. But don't worry, when all else fails, they take you to war. 20% of U.S. offices are vacant. This is from CNN. Yeah, no shit. And you know what the office occupancy rate is? According to Castle Systems? 49.6%. That's right. The office building bust is going to bring down the banks. But this is the way that they slant the news to make you hate the people that they want you to. Uruguay pivots to China from U.S. Today's, all right? The world, much of the world has had enough of the United States. Going back to the economy. When interest rates go down, the dollar's going to go down. It's going to be the beginning of the death of the dollar. The world has had enough of America. Gold prices are going to escalate. FDA approves Mounjaro for weight loss. Drug first cleared for diabetes, blah, 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 blah. It's going to cost $1,000, 60 cents a month. You ready? The drug does come with some side effects, the most common being nausea, vomiting, and other gut woes. Isn't that nicely put? Other gut woes. I mean, it'll fuck you up in a lot of different ways, but, you know, don't eat right. No, don't. Oh, matter of fact, it's not just bullshit coming out of my mouth because I'm not a politician. And again, hey, politicians, who the fuck are you to tell me what to do?
Well, I know there was a little bit of talk out of Washington, D.C., that NBC story said that they were about ready to wash their hands of this thing. But I wonder what else going on in D.C. and what else going on in the war. And what all, as you say, what are these three things going on in Russia, too? The floor is yours.
Yeah, so I mean, the three things going on in Russia that didn't get a lot of notice are both international and domestic. The one you were talking about, the NBC article, was interesting, and it came out. There was a constellation of articles that came out at the same time that are showing this growing pressure on Zelensky to perhaps recognize that Ukraine's not going to win the war, that they're not going to achieve their policy goals on the battlefield, that the longer they try, the worse it might get. And so it might be time at last to turn to the negotiating table. The NBC article was interesting, Scott, because it showed really different language than Washington has used before. It suggested that U.S. and European officials have begun to broach the topic with Zelensky of what it might take to negotiate an end of the war. And it also used language of what Ukraine would be willing to give up. So this is really the first time you're seeing leaking into the public, you know, American, European officials not only saying that it might have to come down to negotiations, but that Ukraine might have to give stuff up. And, you know, there's only really two things that they could mean by Ukraine give stuff up, and that would be territory and NATO ambitions. So that was really interesting.
Well, I mean, what you're telling me is they should have negotiated in the first place, Ted, it sounds like.
So, so Scott, that's just the most tragic thing of the war of all, right? Like, it was really clear in the first days, the first weeks, especially March and April, that first year in Istanbul, it was really clear that Zelensky was entirely willing to negotiate into the war. Even before the war, Zelensky was talking about, you know, we'll give up our NATO aspirations, let's talk. And it was really clear in Istanbul. There's no doubt anymore in Istanbul. I would argue there's no doubt anymore in Istanbul that a tentative agreement between Ukraine and Russia had actually been initialed by the two sides. It had gone that far, where Russia had said they would pull back to their pre-war lines and Ukraine would give up its NATO aspirations. They had agreed to that. And this is the tragedy, Scott. The war at that point could have been over before it had escalated into a huge war, before the massive loss of life, before the massive infrastructure damage. Ukraine and Russia were willing to end the war, and the States wasn't. Yeah. It's really clear now that the States, in fact, the evidence is getting stronger every week, that the U.S. said no to that. And the result has been, as you said, almost 2 years of horrific loss of life, horrific war that in the end has come down to Ukraine being not in a better position on the battlefield to go to the negotiating table, as Biden kept saying. They're in a worse position on the battlefield than they were when they first reached an agreement with Russia. And now they're being pressured to reach a new agreement with Russia that's going to be worse than the one they could have had 2 years ago. So they're gonna come out of this war with a worse agreement they could have had and hundreds of thousands of more deaths because the U.S. said no. You know, and we know the U.S. said no, not just because Russia has said that, but because the Turkish officials in Istanbul have said that, and the former German Chancellor Schröder was who was there. He was asked by Ukraine to negotiate. He's gone public recently, said that Ukraine said no because the Americans told them so they had to check everything with the Americans. So this is a horrific war that need not have happened. And now U.S. officials are saying to Ukraine, you need to talk about, you need to give up. But remember that what they have to give up, the land, they wouldn't have had to give that up at the beginning because the additional land had been taken. They could have had the Minsk Accords where that land would have just been autonomous. Now the agreement's going to have to be they give it up altogether. So what Ukraine's going to have to give up now is much worse than they would have had to give up before. And they've bought this worse settlement at the price of hundreds of thousands of lives. That's the tragedy. This is all on the U.S. That's the tragedy.
Yeah, and of course we had Ukrainian officials that talked to Ukrainian Pravda right away and told the whole story too. And that came from their side, that they felt pressured by Boris Johnson that, boy, I guess we better do what you say.
Yeah, it seems pretty clear that during those Istanbul talks, Johnson showed up and told them that although you may be willing to negotiate with Putin, we're not. There's also a lot of stories. I haven't seen this absolutely confirmed, Scott, but there's also a lot of stories that Johnson said something like, we want you to keep on fighting. If you do, we'll give you all the weapons you need for as long as you need them. And so, Zelensky walked away thinking he kind of had that guarantee of as much as you need for as long as you need them.
Yeah.
And so there was that, there was that pressure too. And the thing is, as much weapons as you need for as long as you need them, for what? It's become really clear now. I mean, first of all, not news. The Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed, right? But Scott, it hasn't just failed. What happened in the counteroffensive is that Russia took up a strategy of going onto the defensive, not trying to acquire territory, but just watching the Ukrainian troops flood in to their defensive lines and just devour them. So that through this war of attrition, they just devoured Ukrainian soldiers and devoured Ukrainian equipment. And people talk about this sort of this stalemate where in a counteroffensive, Ukraine's only managed to gain 17 kilometers of land. And in the months before that, Russia was only able to acquire, 6 kilometers of land. And this is just a complete mistake of metrics, right? Because it's true that Ukraine's fighting to gain land. They have to. They're trying to kick Russia out of their land. Russia's not fighting to gain land. Russia's fighting to beat the Ukrainian army. And the way they do that is by sitting where they are and just,
right,
mowing down. Like, so it's not true that it's at this sort of stalemate. And what's happened in the Ukrainian counteroffensive is because of this, they haven't just failed. They've had such a massive loss of men and arms that they're now completely vulnerable to a Russian counteroffensive. And so what you're starting to see slowly now is that Russia's moving these defensive lines forward, and they're slowly and methodically acquiring land at enormous loss to Ukrainians. So the counteroffensive actually reduced Ukraine to a position of vulnerability that they're now exposed for the situation to get much, much worse on the battlefield than it is now.
Thank you. I would argue that this is almost entirely the fault of the United States. The Russians and the Ukrainians had an agreement until Boris Johnson and Joe Biden said, "Oh, no, we have your back. You're going to become part of NATO." And then we spent $113 billion, and now the president of the United States has asked the Congress, I don't think he's going to get it, for another $68 billion, all because they want to expand NATO. Will the United States, forget the West does what the U.S. demands. Will the United States ever stop this maniacal expansion eastward of NATO, notwithstanding the natural and probable consequences of such an expansion?
Well, the NATO expansion has stopped because the Russian army has stopped it, in effect. But what continues is the Western insistence that NATO will expand. So the reality is already clear. But the continued insistence that NATO will expand means continued war. This has been my point all along. All Biden had to do, going back years, and as recently as December 2021, before all of this broke out, was to say NATO won't enlarge, and then there would not have been a cause of war. The war would not have taken place. But even till today, they still make these claims that, yes, NATO's going to go to Ukraine. So Russia says, well, if NATO's going to come to Ukraine under your view, why are we to stop right now and let that happen? We've been clear for 30 years and extremely clear since 2007 when President Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference, and extremely clear since 2008 when Bill Burns sent his "Niet means Niet" memorandum to Condoleezza Rice. That this is a no. So as soon as you stop saying that it's going to happen and we get down to real political negotiations, then there's a possibility of this war ending. This is very basic. And I think what's so important to understand is this is a group that has played a bad poker hand miserably by continuing to up the ante at every stage, knowing that it's a failed hand, or not even recognizing that it's a failed hand. So if you go back, if I might just very quickly, you go back to 2008, all we had to do was not put NATO enlargement on the table.
Right.
And then in the Yanukovych period, 2010 to February 2014, Russia wasn't demanding territory. Russia was demanding a long-term lease of the Sevastopol naval base. That's all, not territory. And then the United States conspired in the overthrow of Yanukovych. Bad move. That was February 2014. Then Russia took Crimea, not wanting it to fall into NATO hands. But even then, it wasn't demanding the territory of the Donbass, of eastern Ukraine, of Lugansk and Donetsk.
And even then, it was bloodless.
Even then, it was saying, look, don't shell the Russian people. Don't attack them. Give them autonomy under an agreement that was negotiated, the Minsk II agreement. Well, the West, the United States, rejected that. It told Ukraine, you don't have to do that. We don't believe in a federal Ukraine, as if the United States should be the one making a judgment like that, especially after a treaty was negotiated.
Right.
Then as late as December 2021, when President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement, they were not calling for the annexation of eastern Ukraine. They were calling for the Minsk II agreement to be implemented and for NATO to stop saying that it was going to enlarge. In other words, for Ukraine to commit to neutrality. So every step of the way, then the special military operation began on February 24th, and the idea of that was push Zelensky into negotiations. Well, those started a few days after the February 24th incursion. It wasn't to conquer Ukraine, it was to enforce neutrality, stop the NATO enlargement. Zelensky agreed on that in March. The United States rushed in and said, no, you don't agree. We need to weaken Russia. You fight on. We're going to put on all of this weaponry. You're going to get the HIMARS. You're going to get the nuclear option of finance. We're going to cut Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. And all of this predictably failed, overblown hype. And in the end, what we could have expected from the beginning, for Russia, NATO enlargement is an existential issue. Right. NATO is not able to defeat Russia on an existential issue, not least because of 6,000 nuclear weapons, by the way. So there was always a point of escalation. But now with conventional forces, it's been shown to be the case. So you're completely right. This is a disaster that we have made because we absolutely can't listen to anybody else. And President Biden,
Joe Biden is proving the accuracy of what your friend and colleague Henry Kissinger once famously said: it is dangerous to be an enemy of the United States. It is worse to be a friend.
Well, he actually said, if it's quoted correctly, that it's fatal to be a friend.
Wow. All right, that's even stronger.
Now, I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but that's how I quote him. When you hear "we've got your back" for the U.S. saying it, you better worry, because we had the back of a lot of countries, from Afghanistan and Vietnam, South Vietnam, and many others. And we don't understand the politics of the wars that we get in, because these are all about politics.
Let's
if you
get
don't
into
understand the politics, you blow it.
Let's get
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
What history of China do we need to know in order to have the best understanding of what China's up to today?
The U.S. Has very fraught relations from 1949 till the late 1960s with Communist China. We have a pair of war scares over Taiwan. And of course, we have actual fighting with the Chinese forces in Korea. My grandfather was there. In the late 1960s, Nixon and Kissinger decided to open to China in order to try and balance against the Soviet Union. So it was Cold War strategy. And this ushers in a period of fairly good U.S. relations with China. However, it requires diplomatic normalization. And this is a process that takes place over the 1970s. It begins with Nixon and what's called the first joint communique. This was an agreement between the heads of state that said there is but one China and Taiwan is a part of it. Because you see, the United States government had been recognizing the Republic, the so-called Republic of China, on Taiwan as the official government, all the way from 1949 to the late 1960s. This process continued through Carter and then Reagan, producing normalized relations, and the end of the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan that had been signed in the 1950s under Eisenhower. And so under these 1, 2, 3 communiques, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, the United States promised to respect Chinese sovereignty and to work towards the peaceful reunification of Taiwan and the mainland, and to slowly, over time, taper off weapons sales and not to sell them new, more advanced weapons. Not to have high-level diplomatic contacts with Taiwan, not to have military contacts with Taiwan, not to have troops on Taiwan. And over the course of the 1990s, as the China relationship stopped having the same meaning to U.S. strategists, because of course the Soviet Union is gone now. There's no Soviet Union to use China to balance against. Security competition intensifies with China. We have the so-called Third Taiwan Straits crisis, where Bill Clinton sails the aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Strait. This prompts an effort toward military modernization in China that wasn't really noticed and seized upon until the 2010s when you have the pivot to Asia under Obama. So from about 1980 to 2012, you essentially have very good relations between the US and China, focused on integrating China into the world economic system. And the idea here was that as China becomes richer and develops, it will create a middle class who will demand political rights, who will create a republic in China. And then democracies don't fight one another. So this idea of trading with China, incorporating it into the American global system, was going to transform China into a democracy and a compliant security partner, a la the Europeans. That, of course, did not happen. And these sort of mistaken assumptions about what would happen by the 20-teens, early 20-teens, that was being recognized in Washington. A lot of people point to the rise of Xi Jinping as being some great turning point. It really wasn't. It really wasn't. You can find lots of very strident, nationalistic, anti-American rhetoric all the way from Deng and Jiang Zemin. They always viewed it as a partnership of equals, that they were not going to be America's junior partner, and that the United States was going to have to respect Chinese sovereignty and prerogatives. And so today, where the United States is working very hard to contain China, this has created a very fraught period of relations because now, of course, China is pretty wealthy, has modernized its military, and as we saw when Nancy Pelosi took her trip to Taiwan last year, is very, very capable of blockading Taiwan. And that's where we are today, with President Biden saying, even though we no longer have a mutual defense agreement with Taiwan, if attacked, we will defend Taiwan militarily with no authorization from Congress.
The 21st century is going to be economically the century of China. And my children will be living in the 21st century and they're going to be prepared for it. So he certainly feels like it's a good place to invest in. So what's the con view of that?
Well, I would say that a lot of the things that allowed China to become industrialized and rich, those conditions just don't hold anymore. For example, the idea of China being the workshop of the world. Well, China became the workshop of the world due to differentials in labor costs, labor protection, environmental protections. China is no longer the low-cost workshop of everything. If you go to Walmart, for example, one of the things that I do when I go to Walmart is I just pick up random items and look and see where they're made. And several years ago, everything was from China. Today, if you pick it up, you're increasingly getting stuff from Thailand, Vietnam, India. Very interesting stuff. Major multinational corporations are diversifying their supply chains away from China. And there are a variety of reasons for this, some of which have to do with the opacity of the political system. Some of it has to do with how draconian their COVID policy was. We have to imagine some kind of epidemic like that is going to happen again. They shut down their entire economy for years. No multinational wants to deal with that kind of risk. The other thing I would say is China had a surplus of working age population people. That was a one-off boost. That was a great thing they got, but it was one-off. Now China is graying very rapidly. There are going to be half as many Chinese in 50 years as there are now. India is already much more populous than China, eclipsed them far ahead of what people thought was going to happen 20 years ago. I can't emphasize enough just how bad their demographic situation is. The United States and China are militarizing the strait and preparing for a clash over the island. People are seeing that, you know what, there are a lot of additional risks that don't show up in just a basic bean counting estimation of this, and maybe we need to get our stuff out of there. So in terms of fighting over Taiwan just for chips, no, not worth it, not worth it. And the hawks will generally talk in terms of the technology will fall into China's hands. And that's why we need to do it. That would never happen because the United States has already said publicly they would destroy, that they would literally bomb out of existence those very factories if a war over Taiwan started and they thought they were going to lose, which it looks like they would. So it's not as though China would even get hold of these plants in the event of a conflict. So no, I don't think it's worth it. I think it is a pretext, like so many other things. I mean, even if China had them, why wouldn't China want to sell them to the rest of the world, right? Well, what good is it just to hold all of the semiconductors? Doesn't make any sense. But of course, if you watch like Meet the Press or something like that, follow-up questions are never asked. It's just, why should we fight over chips? Well, we should do it for this reason. It's like, well, that sounds good to me.
Yeah, right.
Sounds
well,
good
the
to
same
me.
thing was about oil.
Right.
So-and-so's going to have all the oil.
Yeah.
But what would you do with it? I mean, unless you have a fetish for it, what would you do with it?
Drink it?
Yeah.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Now, Powell also
talked about the consumer again, right? The resilient. This is his favorite word, just like transitory was when he talked about inflation. It's resilient, right? Every time he talks, that's his word, right? Resilient consumer. Well, I mean, is the consumer really that resilient? I mean, sure, he's still spending money, but you've got to look at why. I mean, it's not like, the consumer is resilient like Superman is resilient to bullets, right? You shoot Superman and the bullets just bounce off his chest, like no big deal. The consumer is not resilient like that. The consumer is getting shot, and those bullets are hurting. They're doing damage, right? The consumer is bleeding and hurting, but he's still breathing. He's still alive. He's badly wounded, but he's resilient enough not to be dead. And how is the consumer staying alive, with all these bullets, right? Well, one way he's doing that is by depleting his savings, right? A lot of consumers, got a big boost. They got these COVID stimulus checks, and so they had those, and so they spent that. That's gone. The other thing the consumer is doing is, maxing out the credit cards. Credit card debt is at an all-time record high, even though credit card interest rates are at an all-time record high. It's almost 21% now is the average rate on credit card debt. What's the other thing that's enabling the consumer to survive all these bullets is taking on additional jobs. I've been discussing that on the podcast. We got, again, on the jobs numbers that we got last week, and I think that's also what's driving the narrative that the Fed is done hiking, is based on how weak the non-farm payroll report was last week. It was extremely weak. But one thing that was strong was second and third jobs. It was a surge, almost 400,000. We have more Americans than ever before working 2 or 3 jobs. That's how the consumer is remaining resilient. He's working more, right? And that's what he needs to do to keep on spending. So deplete your savings, max out your credit cards, and get a sucking job. Now, if you want to describe that as well, we got this resilient consumer. The consumer is going to bleed out because eventually there's no way to survive. He's mortally wounded. He's just delaying death by all of these means that he has at his disposal. All right, so one thing that happened during the week that really was a shot across the bow with this bull market, and it should have done more damage. And in fact, the market sold off on Thursday, the stock market, the bond market, in reaction to this. But the government held its routine Treasury bond auction. And this particular auction that we had yesterday was one of the weakest auctions they've ever had, meaning that it was very sloppy. There was not a lot of demand for treasuries. Now, I don't know why there's any demand for treasuries, and eventually there won't be, but there was enough demand to get the auction off, but in a very bad way. I mean, people that were grading this, would give it an F. I think Rick Santelli gave it a D- because, there were enough buyers there to get it done, right? It wasn't like a failed auction where the Treasury held an auction and nobody showed up or not enough people showed up. They showed up, but not in a big way. The big to cover ratio was 2.23, which was the lowest since December of 2021. But more importantly, the tail in this auction was the longest ever, and that is an indication of weakness. And what the tail is in a bond auction is it's the difference between the average rate on the bonds and the highest rate that the government has to pay. And so when you have a long tail, that means in order to complete the auction, it had to extend out to bidders that didn't want to pay as much. And this was the longest tail since they started measuring it. And so that indicates that the government is running out of buyers. They haven't run out completely yet, but it was a bad auction, and it doesn't bode well for Treasury bonds and for the U.S. economy. But the market's already shrugged that off today, right? We had a huge rally in the stock market today. So they shrugged it off. But this is a bad sign. It's what I've been warning about. And eventually, the auctions are going to be a lot worse than this because eventually there won't be enough buyers. I mean, why people want to buy these bonds? Investors still believe that inflation is going to go down. I mean, they still think the Fed's going to succeed in lowering inflation down to 2%. I mean, that's why gold had such a bad week, because even though the stock market rallied on the idea that the Fed is done hiking and is going to start cutting, the expectations are that even though the Fed is cutting, it's only going to be 75 basis points. The markets expect inflation to drop a lot more than 75 basis points. And so the expectation is for real interest rates to go up. And it's the expectation of higher real interest rates that is weighing on the gold price. I mean, it's pushing up the dollar somewhat, but it's weighing more heavily on gold because everybody thinks gold is a function of real rates. And as long as real interest rates are rising, that's bad for gold. Now, in a way, they're right, positive real interest rates is good for gold, but we don't actually have positive real interest rates because the inflation rate is made up. What they're looking at is the CPI, the official government measure of inflation, and they're using that to determine whether rates are negative or positive. But they're actually negative. We don't have positive real rates. We have negative real rates if you use a real rate of inflation instead of a phony rate of inflation. But the reality is, rather than real interest rates rising, which is what the gold traders expect, real interest rates are going to collapse when inflation takes off. And in the face of that, the Fed cuts rates anyway, because the Fed is more concerned about propping up the financial system, the banks, the government, bailing out everybody, trying to kick the can down the road. We know what the Fed is going to do. When push comes to shove, they already showed their hand earlier this year when we had the beginning of the banking crisis back in March. I mean, every time there's been a crisis, the Fed has responded the same way. And I'm confident that they're going to continue that, despite the fact that inflation is so much higher than their 2% target. But because inflation is so much higher than their 2% target, they're not going to get the benign outcome that they're used to. The stimulus is going to be a sedative, and it's going to be a dollar crisis and a sovereign debt crisis.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
The next that we saw from some spin from what's going on, Israel, Gaza thingy things. Israel sees military control over Gaza after the war. European Union and Muslim majority countries or the local political leaders in Gaza said, all right, here's the part I want to focus on. We don't want to govern Gaza. We don't want to have to run their lives. We just want to protect our people. I don't know. This is just what they keep saying. It's like, we're doing all these horrible things, and we don't want to do all these horrible things. It's just that we want this other thing. It's like, we don't want to have to tax you. We just want to fund you. You're still doing it. It doesn't matter what, like, in my opinion, it doesn't matter what got you there. And sure, I guess there's a distinction between somebody who wants to kill you just for the thrill of killing you and somebody that wants, I'm only killing you because you have money in your house and I want to take your money. I'd rather not have to kill you. Yeah, sure. I guess there's a distinction between that and a serial killer. But at the end of the day, you're killing somebody. And they keep going with this. Like, we don't want to have to do this. Some other spin. Oh, well, this was just kind of the latest from Israel. Israel agrees to 4-hour daily pause in Gaza fighting to allow civilians to flee, White House says. Let's just read this. This is from the AP. Similar short-term pauses have occurred over the last several days as tens of thousands of civilians have fled southward. But Thursday's announcement appeared to be an effort to formalize and expand the process as the U.S. has pressed Israelis to take greater steps to protect civilians in Gaza. Biden's push for an even longer pause comes as part of a renewed diplomatic push to free hostages taken by Hamas and other militant groups to the Gaza Strip during their October 7th surprise attack on Israel. Israeli officials estimate that militants to blah, blah, blah. Kirby told reporters Thursday that the pause could be useful to getting all 239. All right. The point I want to harp in on is that the claim has been that the Israelis have told these people to leave and they've chosen not to, or they've been forced to remain as human shields. So isn't the fact that after pressure from outside forces agreeing to create some sort of a humanitarian corridor and giving people 3-hour warning that they'll have a 4-hour window in which to pass through your corridor would imply the fact that you were keeping people in the area against their will? Isn't there an implication of the fact that after being forced to provide people a safe way of passage, that they didn't previously have a safe way of passage? And so therefore, when you were killing them, it's not that they just chose to remain and be a human shield? Because remember, the old system was, you drop a leaflet on their house, you tell them that they're it. If they choose to stay, then they've chosen to be a human shield, and then you have no choice. You'd rather just get the terrorists, but you have no choice but to kill them. But isn't this a little bit of an admission of the fact that I guess you were involved in them being held there, or that you weren't giving them the proper opportunity to leave? And then even this just seems like, imagine if no one was being killed, but they were just being forced from their homes. Why is that okay? I was reading this article, Northern Gaza exodus surges as siege builds, and it was getting into the fact that they're being sent to like some beach that isn't really set up to house them, and they're even talking about old people basically just being like pushed in computer chairs, and you're like, why is that even an option? I get that I'm not fully researched on who's here, who's there, how much Hamas hates Israel, and what the workable solutions are. But I don't know, the concept of we're just going to indiscriminately blow up people's houses, or hey, we told them just to abandon their home and go to an area for an unknown amount of time without the resources to have them. And so if they chose not to do so, well, then them being blown up in their own home is on them. All right, moving on. Zelensky calls for unity, says time isn't right for elections. That's some world-class government spin right there. Isn't that great? Zelensky calls for unity, says time isn't right for elections. That seems like a convenient way to become a dictator. King Charles expressed his deepest regrets for violence during Kenya's independence struggle from Britain, but didn't offer apology that victims and their descendants called for. To be honest, I wasn't even familiar of this violence during the Kenyan incident, so as far as I'm concerned, I could have just gone with regrets. I didn't really need his deepest regrets. All right, here's the next one is you got this ongoing Hunter probes, and, I think the latest is that they're saying that they've, we'll get to it later in the show. But I was once talking to a friend of mine about some professional problems I was having at work. And he was telling me that they got this role because he's got all the fancy corporate training. He's worked for all the big companies. And he said one of the big things that you have to do when you work at a big old fancy corporation is you got to get everybody in the room. You got to get all the different agencies, all the different people. You got to get everyone in the room. Because if anyone's not in the room, everyone's going to point the finger and say there was a miscommunication with that person. It was a miscommunication with that department. Oh, I assigned it to this department. Well, I handed it over to Steve. Well, I handed it over to Mike. Well, Mike said that Steve was working on it. Well, when Steve re-reviewed it, he said that he was missing the paperwork from Mike and handed it back to Mike. When Mike looked at it, he realized he had to wait till he got this information from payroll. Oh, payroll never even saw this document. How's it possible that payroll never saw the document? Well, it's because Mike never handed it to payroll. Oh, Mike, is it true you never handed it to payroll? Well, that was because of the conversation I had with Steve. There you go. That's all of corporations in a nutshell. And that's why you got to do, what you got to do when you got to be a manager? You got to get everybody in the room. You got to get Steve in the room. You got to get payroll in the room. You got to get Mike in the room. And that's why you can actually solve who's responsible for what, who made what decision, who needs to be fired, who needs to be promoted, and you can start fixing the problems. Because if not, it's always a Mike gave it to Steve, gave him a telephone, blame it on payroll, circle jerk. I've noticed that when it comes to government, we have that exact problem. You got 45 different branches. It's always a miscommunication. You never get everybody in the room. So you get Garland in the room, and he goes, well, that guy had complete authority to do it. Then you get the guy who they said had complete authority to go do the investigation, and he starts going, well, yeah, I had the complete authority, but it wasn't in a nutshell. And this is no way to manage and figure out what went wrong. You have to actually get Garland in the room. You got to get this guy in the room. You got anyone else that they can possibly blame, and you got to get them all in the room and go, why was this decision made? That's the only way you ever get to the bottom of these things. But government's not set up for that. Government, if anything, it wants to run its efficiencies and then go, you know what we need? We need a Department of Inefficiencies to study the inefficiencies. And they go, you know what? We just didn't have enough money here for the Department of Inefficiencies. With more money at the Department of Inefficiencies, we can finally get rid of these inefficiencies. And you're like, dude, you guys have had so much more money. Every single year we give you more and more money, and we're doing nothing but tracking more efficiencies. That's because you didn't give us enough money, and there's also that inflation problem. All right, anyways, let's actually read these two paragraphs that I highlighted from the article. I am and have been the decision maker on this case, we said, according to an opening statement issued during the closed-door hearing, transcripts of which weren't immediately made public. I do not, however, make these decisions in a vacuum. There are processes that I must adhere to in making investigative and charging decisions. These processes did not interfere with my decision-making authority. So therefore, I had the full authority, but I had to talk to other people. So it's not on me. It's on the process. I don't know. Bullshit.
Today in history, November 10th, 1798, the Kentucky General Assembly passed resolutions drafted by Thomas Jefferson in response to the hated Alien and Sedition Acts, and they are loaded with Jeffersonian principles on the structure of the Constitution. So on this episode, I've got 5 of those core principles rooted in the principles of the American Revolution, the radical change in the viewpoints of the people from 1760 or so till the shot heard round the world in 1775, plus a bonus 6th one if I have time on what to do about usurpation of power. And let's start it out with the first one, and that is that government does not have unlimited power. That is the basis of everything. It is only authorized to do a certain amount of things, and that's how he starts out these resolutions. Resolved that the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. And if we look to the Declaration of Independence, that list of grievances, which were really called in the Declaration itself, injuries and usurpations, this is one of them, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with a power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. And of course, if you've been following the show, you know that that's in reference to the Declaratory Act of 1766, where the King and British Parliament claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This is unlimited power. Thomas Paine, of course, said such unlimited power can belong only to God, and that's why you had to keep fighting even when the odds were so much against them in the winter of 1776. This was the root cause of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain, that they claimed this unlimited power over them in all cases whatsoever. So it's no surprise that Jefferson started out his Kentucky resolutions with that in the first line. So number 2 is about consent, but he ties it in here near the end with this idea of all cases whatsoever, unlimited power. And he's talking about how the resolution should be passed along to other states. And he says it is our hope, basically, that they will concur with this Commonwealth in considering the said acts as so palpably against the Constitution as to amount to an undisguised declaration that the compact, that's the Constitution, is not meant to be the measure of the powers of the general government, but that will proceed in the exercise over these states of all powers whatsoever. Jefferson certainly knew what he was doing when he used that phrase, all powers whatsoever. Anyone who knew anything at the time knew this was a reference to the British claiming power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever in the Declaratory Act. And he goes on, he says that they will view this as seizing the rights of the states and consolidating them in the hands of the general government with a power assumed to bind the states, not merely in cases made federal, so those in pursuance of the Constitution, of the delegated powers of the Constitution, but in all cases whatsoever, by laws made not with their consent, but by others against their consent. So if the people of the several states consented through the ratification process just a few years, not that long before this, they consented to a constitution which created a new general government, and that general government was only authorized to exercise certain powers that were in the Constitution. That means they did not consent to the government going beyond those limits. And as soon as they go beyond that, that is an injury and it's a usurpation. It's also something that is listed in the Declaration of Independence. The word consent is in there a few times. For example, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Number 3 is really that 10th Amendment argument about delegated and reserved powers, a line in the sand about what the general government is authorized to do, the federal government, and what is reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. And he points out, again, the states are not united on a principle of unlimited submission, but he said that by compact under the style and title of a Constitution for the United States and of amendments thereto, they constituted a general government for special purposes, delegated to that government certain definite powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government. And when you're talking about the people of the several states, again, this is about they consented to the Constitution at that time, and they all delegated a certain amount of power, and everything else is not with their consent. And there is a clean line in the sand. Now, number 4 is that the Constitution is supreme, not the government. The government doesn't get to determine the limits of itself. It is the created, the people of the several states created via the Constitution, the general government. So the general government doesn't get to determine the limits of its own power, because again, that would give them unlimited power. And this is how Jefferson described it. The government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, since that would have made its discretion, and not the Constitution, the measure of its powers. So for Thomas Jefferson, the people of the several states created a constitution. They created a set of limited delegated powers that the general government was authorized to exercise. And it wasn't up to that government to determine whether or not it was going beyond the limits of its own powers. He said, but that, as in all other cases of compact among parties having no common judge, each party has an equal right to judge for itself, as well of infractions as of the mode and measure of redress. So each party to the compact, and the parties to the compact, as James Madison also described in his report of 1800 about the Virginia resolutions of 1798, that the parties to the compact are the people of the several states. So ultimately, the sovereignty, final authority is with the people of the several states, and each state, the people, can make their own determination of whether or not they view something as constitutional or not. Maybe it's just expressing opinion, but if they have that opinion, it is also up to them to determine how they want to deal with it, the mode and measure of redress. So number 4 is constitutional supremacy, not federal supremacy. And number 5, we're just going to use one word, void. And here's Jefferson's take. Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. If the government, by exercising powers not delegated to it, is consequently exercising, in essence, setting the foundation for unlimited power, then automatically, in principle and in theory, any power that's not authorized to them, not delegated to them, is void. That's the same principle that Patrick Henry took in response to the Stamp Act, because if it's void, and even Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 33 talking about federal supremacy, and this is my paraphrase, he said, those acts that are not supreme are usurpations of power and deserve to be treated as such. So if you're treating something that is void, a usurpation of power as such, it's as if it doesn't exist. So it has no force in law. And this is very similar to what James Otis Jr. Now, John Adams referred to James Otis Jr.'s speech against the writs of assistance in 1761 as the beginning of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain. And this is James Otis, many things that he said in that long speech, but he said an act against the Constitution is void, because if they're not authorized to do it, it is not law, and therefore no one is bound to obey it.
That we're going to be talking about a lot bigger than most people are starting to recognize. It was 2 days ago. The payments on the national debt went to over $1 trillion, and nobody cares. You know, they're still, even this week, Republicans and Democrats were spending more money, sending more money overseas, looking for another fight someplace. You know, has no effect on the warmongering and the militarism that we have, and no effect on the welfare state, because we have to be humanitarians. We don't want to be accused of not liking people. But if you had freedom, that would be the real, generous offers to people, because that's where people prosper, and people generally prosper with their civil liberties when they don't have war to worry about. But anyway, that's a big event. It's a seminal event, and there's been several of those throughout the history, starting with the Federal Reserve Board, and systematically we undermined the gold standard. It took over 100 years to totally destroy it, and it's been getting weaker and weaker.
Yes, Dr. Paul, that chart is very telling. And pretty scary, because interest payments can bury you. That's when the end game shows up. And our financial situation is very similar to the medical debacle that we went through. It was paved by experts, and this financial disaster is paved by experts. The job of an economist, a real economist, is to tell politicians what they cannot do. Because politicians, they're driven by what the public wants, and a lot of times what the public wants is just not viable. So the economist, his job is to tell the politician the truth. You can't give something away for free. It's not free. You can't fix the price of that. Who do you think you are? You can't fix prices. Prices are not arrived by dictate. You're going to create a disaster. But unfortunately, that's not what an economist today does. If you want to be a successful economist, you have to tell the politician that's a great idea. And then you go to the public and explain that, yes, free healthcare is a great idea. Free this, free that. And you'll become somebody, in the economic world publicly. Now, it's all a lie, but, people don't really care about that. They, if they can live a good life materially, they'll go on TV and say debt doesn't matter and deficits don't matter. Just print more money. There's always somebody that's willing to do that. So that's what an economist has become today. And that's why we have this financial debacle that is just waiting to hit us hard. But again, there was nobody telling the truth. So the Americans don't know the truth. And, down this bad road, we continue to go.
The banking system prior to 1913 still had difficulties. It was not perfect. They suspended it during the Civil War. And yet there was still a lot of respect for the gold standard. So when they would wander off and cause a recession, they always went back to the gold. But in 1913, it was decided the bankers got together and they had the Federal Reserve Act passed. And this was, the purpose of it was to stabilize the banking system. And just think in our short period of time, in the last 20 years, how many unstable banks have we dealt with? But it wasn't permanent. It was bad and horrible, but it's going to get a lot worse because they were always bailed out because there was still some trust in fiat. But we have this printed press money, so we can bail banks out and stabilize it. As long as the banks are stable, people don't have to worry about their deposit. It used to be even the average depositor would lose their money, no government insurance. I don't think people are going to lose that anymore. That shouldn't give you reassurance. It just means that the government is going to paper everything over, and that is what the fiat is all about. All the junk bonds, because they over-invested in the government programs, put it in the housing bubble. Everybody should have known there was a bubble, and the bubble collapsed. But that was in 08, and now we're in a position now where they can't stop spending. There's too many powerful political forces. We have a foreign policy that's doomed to fail. And the big question is, what's going to happen next? And that is a big question. The one thing is I have no confidence that we're going to get enough help in Washington that they will devise a system that will be smart and deliberate, and the people will understand why you have to start living within your own means. No, they want money to solve the problem, and that's what they do. They come in and they print more money, and yet it doesn't work. So that's where we are. This announcement that we went over, this landmark-ish date of $1 trillion a year. It may turn out to be a bigger one-day event than what I thought was happening in 1971.
I think so too, Dr. Paul. And unfortunately, this is going to catch a lot of people by surprise. And by this, I don't mean today or tomorrow, whenever. The numbers, you can't beat this. So, and we can't expect, to go to the television and to be soothed that they're going to tell you the truth. Hopefully we have a lot of precedents that we're going through of just how much this propaganda machine lies. I mean, obviously COVID, and that I think had a major effect on people. However, people still go back to the TV. I don't understand it. Even after COVID, they'll go back and, we went through the Ukraine thing and look how long that lasted. And people were told over and over, Ukraine is winning. They're going to win. We have to keep sending them money, sending them weapons. And Zelensky's meeting with actors and this and that. It's all big show. He's globetrotting. And then all of a sudden gone. Putin, I guess, is not going to take over Europe and not going to be the next Hitler, but everybody's moved on. So it's, once you see this, it's like getting yourself out of a cult with this media. So, because when you turn on that television, you're going to hear all the lies. You'll have the Fed go, oh, we need to get up to 2%. And now they're saying, oh, no, we need to get down to 2%. And, this week, somebody went on, an advisor, I talked about advisors, my first thing. An advisor to Biden went on television and said, I don't think there's a leader out there who wouldn't rather have the economic record that President Biden has today. And she said it with a straight face right on television, and people watch it, and I guess some of them believe it. So it's important to turn away from the propaganda machine because it is not your friend. It's your enemy. If there's one thing that Trump got right, it's that the media is the enemy. And, that's the only way. The more people that get out and rip themselves away from it, the better off we'll be.